The man didn't even knock. Victor Hale shoved the door of Silas Boone's ranch wide open like he owned it, because in his mind, he owned everything in this valley. He looked straight at Naomi Carter, a woman who had spent 3 days surviving on half a biscuit and creek water, and he smiled, not a kind smile, the kind men wear when they've already decided the answer. "Pack your things," he said, "both of you, tonight." Lydia, 8 years old and still holding a piece of bread she hadn't finished, looked up at her mother. Naomi didn't move. "I don't work for you," Naomi said quietly. Victor stepped closer. "You don't work for anyone if I say so." And that was the moment, that one sentence, that changed everything. If that were you standing in that kitchen, with your child watching and nowhere left to go, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories about real courage, hard choices, and people who refuse to be broken move something in you, please subscribe to this channel and follow Naomi's story all the way to the end. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The winter of 1884 arrived early in Montana. Not the kind of early that surprises people, the kind that the old ranchers feel in their knees a full week before it happens. And so they stack wood, they salt meat, they bring the horses closer to the barn. The kind of early that kills anything that isn't ready. Naomi Carter was not ready. She hadn't been ready for most of that year. She was 31 years old, though she looked both younger and older than that depending on the light. Younger in the eyes. She had those clear, steady brown eyes that people in difficult circumstances either lose completely or hold on to like the last coin in a pocket. Older everywhere else. Her hands were rough from laundry work she'd done in Billings through the summer. Her boots had been restitched twice by a cobbler who finally told her, gently, that there was nothing left worth stitching. She had 12 cents. She had a suitcase with a broken latch that she held shut with a strip of leather she'd cut from an old harness belt she found behind a feed store. And she had Lydia. Lydia Margaret Carter, 8 years old, was the kind of child who asked questions about everything. Not to be difficult, but because she genuinely wanted to know how the world worked. She wanted to know why some clouds made rain and others didn't. She wanted to know if horses dreamed. She wanted to know why the man at the third ranch they'd visited had laughed at her mother instead of answering her. Naomi hadn't answered that one. She'd just taken Lydia's hand and kept walking. They'd been walking for 3 days through the outer edge of the Willow Ridge Valley when Naomi made herself a promise. One more door. She would knock on one more door. If that door closed like all the others, she would figure out something else. She didn't know what yet, but she would figure it out because that was what she did. She always figured something out. That was the one thing Thomas's death hadn't taken from her. Her husband had been gone 14 months now, thrown from a horse during a cattle drive, dead before they could get a doctor to him, and in the months that followed, the debts had surfaced one by one like stones rising from a dried-up riverbed. The boarding house, the feed account, the loan he'd taken that he'd never told her about, because he'd been planning to pay it back before she found out, and he'd run out of time. She didn't blame him. She'd stopped blaming him around the same time she'd stopped crying about it, which was around the same time she realized that crying and blaming didn't feed Lydia. So she walked. The road to the Boone Ranch wasn't much of a road. It was more of an understanding between wagon wheels and frozen mud that had reached a kind of reluctant agreement over many years. The fence line was visible from a quarter-mile away. Old cedar posts, some leaning, the wire between them slack in places where it hadn't been tended. The barn needed paint. The house beyond it had smoke coming from the chimney, which meant someone was home, which meant the fire was lit, which meant there was wood, which meant... She stopped herself. She'd learned not to stack assumptions. Stacked assumptions were how you fell harder. "Is this the one?" Lydia asked. She was carrying the small canvas bag that held her own things. A change of clothes, a picture she'd drawn of their old house in Billings, and a carved wooden horse that had been Thomas's when he was a boy. "This is the one," Naomi said. "What if he says no?" "Then we'll figure something else out." Lydia looked at her with those serious eyes she'd had since she was 3 years old. "You always say that." "I know." "Do you always mean it?" Naomi looked down at her daughter for a moment. "Mostly," she said honestly. Lydia seemed to accept that. She reached up and took her mother's free hand, and together they walked the last 100 yards to the front gate of the Boone Ranch. Silas Boone heard the knock and didn't move for a full 10 seconds. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and a leather harness he'd been meaning to mend for 3 weeks. The knock surprised him, not because people never came to his door, but because it was nearly dark. The temperature had dropped hard in the last hour, and most people with any sense were home by now. Visitors at near dark in November were rarely good news. He opened the door. She was standing straight. He noticed that first, not that she was tired or cold or thin, though she was all three of those things, but that she was standing straight, back like a fence post, chin level, eyes meeting his without apology or performance. She had a suitcase in one hand and a little girl holding the other, and she looked at him the way a person looks at something they need but have too much pride to beg for. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said. Her voice was steady. "I'm looking for work. I can cook, I can clean, I can manage a house, and help with light ranch work. I'm not asking for charity. I'll earn whatever I'm paid, and I won't waste your time or mine. I have a daughter. She's well behaved, and she won't be any trouble." She paused exactly 1 second. "Do you have work?" Silas looked at her. Then he looked at the little girl, who was looking back at him with an expression of absolute seriousness, like she was witnessing a business negotiation and had been briefed on its importance. He looked back at Naomi. "It's almost dark," he said. "I noticed. It's going to snow tonight." "I noticed that too." He stood in the doorway a moment longer than he should have. I was 43 years old, and he had lived alone on this ranch for 6 years, which was how long it had been since his wife, Clara, had died of fever in the summer of 1878. He had a housekeeper who came twice a week from town, a ranch hand named Deke, who slept in the bunkhouse and showed up most mornings, and a very organized system of solitude that required almost nothing from anyone. He liked it that way. He had decided he liked it that way. He stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." It was not a yes to work. It was not a yes to anything. It was just, "Come inside, it's cold." And Naomi understood the difference, but she walked through the door anyway because right now, "come inside" was enough. She told him the situation plainly, sitting at his kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of fresh coffee that she drank slowly because her stomach hadn't had anything warm in it since the previous morning. She didn't embellish. She didn't ask for sympathy. She told him her husband had died, that she'd lost the house, that she'd been looking for work since late September and hadn't been able to hold anything because every ranch and household in the valley either didn't want a widow with a child or didn't have work to offer, and that she needed a place to work through the winter and would take whatever was fair. Silas listened without interrupting. He had a habit of stillness, the kind that some people mistook for coldness, but was really just the quality of a man who had learned that his first reaction was not always his best one. "How old is she?" he asked, nodding toward Lydia, who had fallen asleep in the chair beside her mother, head tipped against her own shoulder, the wooden horse still in her hand. 8. "She go to school?" "When we were in Billings, yes. I've been teaching her myself this fall." He looked at the sleeping child a moment longer than he intended to. Then he looked back at his coffee. "I had a housekeeper," he said. "Mrs. Pruitt. She comes Tuesdays and Fridays. The house is managed." "Managed isn't the same as cared for," Naomi said. She wasn't being rude. She was just being accurate, the way she always was, because she'd found that accuracy moved things along faster than politeness. Silas glanced around the kitchen, the cold oven, the dishes drying on the rack that had been there since Tuesday, the curtain above the window that had come half loose from its rod and he'd been meaning to fix, and he did not argue. "I can't pay much," he said. "I'm not asking for much. It's not permanent. I'm not asking for permanent." He was quiet again. Outside, the first sounds of wind were picking up, and both of them could feel the temperature shifting, the specific quiet of a house bracing for snow. "1 week," Silas said finally. "I'll see how it goes. You and the girl can have the back room. It's small." "Small is fine." "I don't want—" He stopped and started again more carefully. "I live a certain way, quiet. I don't want disruption." Naomi looked at him steadily. "Mr. Boone, I have been walking in the cold for 3 days. My daughter ate the last of our food this morning. I don't have the energy to disrupt anything. I just need to work." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. Not pity. something more like recognition. All right, he said, but she was up before him the next morning. He came downstairs at 5:30, his normal time, the hour when the ranch work started, and found the kitchen already warm, bread already in the oven, the curtain above the window rehung and straightened, and Naomi at the stove with her back to him, turning salt pork in a cast iron pan like she'd been doing it in that kitchen for years. She heard him on the stairs and said, without turning around, "Coffee's on the counter. Bread will be ready in 15 minutes. I found the storeroom. You're low on flour, but you have enough for the week if I'm careful." He stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at her for a moment. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." He poured his coffee and sat down, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, someone else was making sounds in his kitchen, and the strange thing was, it didn't bother him the way he'd been certain it would. What he noticed over the following 3 days was not what he'd expected. He'd expected adequacy, someone going through the motions of work, doing enough to justify the arrangement. What he got was something else entirely. Naomi worked like she was personally offended by disorder. The root cellar got reorganized. A door hinge that had been sticking for a year was oiled and adjusted. She found a crack along the back wall of the kitchen that had been letting cold air in and packed it with a strip of rag and tallow, with a matter-of-fact efficiency that made him feel, briefly, somewhat embarrassed to have lived with it so long. Lydia, meanwhile, had attached herself to the barn. Not in a nuisance way. She asked permission first, and she asked seriously, standing in front of Silas, with her hands clasped in front of her, like she was presenting a legal case. Could she look at the horses? Just look, she wasn't going to touch them unless he said it was fine. He said she could look. 2 hours later, he found her in the barn talking to the older gray mare, Hester, explaining in careful detail why clouds didn't all make rain. Hester appeared to be listening. "She talking back?" Silas asked. Lydia looked up, startled. "Horses don't talk." "You sure about that?" "Hester's got opinions." Lydia stared at him, completely uncertain whether he was joking or not, which was a fair response, since Silas himself wasn't entirely sure. It was on the 5th day that the trouble arrived. Naomi was behind the house splitting kindling, something she'd started doing on day 3 because the supply was low, and the woodpile was right there, and she was not the kind of person who waited for someone else to do a visible task. When she heard the sound of horses coming up the road, not one horse, several, and moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with a friendly visit, she set down the hatchet. She stood up. There were 4 of them. 3 were hired men, the kind whose job is to look like hired men, which they did, effectively. The 4th was someone she hadn't met, but recognized immediately by the way he sat on his horse, like the horse in the road, and probably the valley existed primarily to frame him correctly. Victor Hale was somewhere in his mid-50s. He had a face that had once been handsome and was now something more than handsome, confident to the edge of something uglier, the way a building can be impressive until you notice it was designed to be imposing rather than welcoming. He wore a coat that cost more than most families in Willow Ridge spent on clothes in a year. He had a way of looking at a situation that suggested he was already calculating its usefulness to him. He looked at Naomi the way men like him always look at women in uncertain situations, like he was determining the asking price. "You're the woman from the Carter widow?" he said, though he clearly already knew. "I'm Naomi Carter," she said. She did not pick up the hatchet. She also did not step back. "You're working for Silas Boone." "I am," Victor smiled. It was a prepared smile, the kind practiced until it looked natural, which meant it never quite did. "I could use someone like you at my house. Better pay, better situation, better future." He gestured toward the ranch around them with a small, dismissive wave, like he was describing a minor inconvenience. "This," he said, "is a dead end." Naomi looked at him. She did not look at his expensive coat, or his expensive horse, or his men. She looked at him. "I'm not interested," she said. The smile held, but something behind it shifted. "Mrs. Carter, I'm not sure you understand what I'm offering." "I understand it fine. My offer doesn't stay open." "That's all right," Naomi said. "I didn't ask you to make one." Victor Hale looked at her for a long moment. The smile was completely gone now. What was underneath it was less practiced and considerably less pleasant. "You'll regret turning your back on the wrong people out here," he said. "This valley's small. You need friends." "I need work," she said. "I have that." He looked at the house. He looked at the barn. He looked back at her. Silas Boone's got nothing left to give you, he said, and before long, he's going to have even less. He pulled his horse around. The three men followed, and Naomi stood behind that house with the hatchet on the ground beside her and the cold wind coming off the hills and listened to the sound of them leaving until it was gone. Then she picked up the hatchet and kept splitting wood, because the fire still needed tending, because Lydia was inside. Because whatever Victor Hale had meant by that last thing he'd said, she could not afford to spend the afternoon being afraid of it. But she had heard it. She had stored it away, carefully, in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed to be returned to. And somewhere in that same cold afternoon, in a part of herself she would not have admitted to yet, she understood that the door she'd walked through 5 days ago had not just offered her a week of work. It had walked her straight into the middle of something she hadn't been told about yet. Something that was already moving, and already had her name in it. She didn't know all of it yet, but she was beginning to. She didn't tell Silas about Victor Hale's visit that evening. She thought about it. She stood at the stove stirring a pot of bean soup and thought about exactly how she would say it, and each version of the sentence felt like either too much or too little. Either she was making it bigger than it was, or she was handing him a problem that wasn't hers to hand anyone yet. So she said nothing. She served the soup. She listened to Lydia tell Silas, at considerable length, about a theory she had developed regarding why Hester the mare preferred the left side of the stall to the right, and she watched Silas listen to this theory with the careful attention of a man who had not had anyone talk to him at dinner in a very long time. He didn't know what to do with it. That was the honest truth of the thing. He kept almost smiling and then stopping himself, like smiling was a door he'd gotten out of the habit of opening. He'd answer Lydia's questions in short sentences. Then Lydia would generate 3 more questions from the answer, and he'd answer those too, and somewhere in the middle of it he'd forget to look uncomfortable. Naomi watched all of this without appearing to watch it. She was good at that. What she was not good at, as it turned out, was sleeping. She lay in the small back room that night, Lydia pressed warm against her side, already deep in the uncomplicated sleep of children who have been fed and are not cold. And she stared at the dark ceiling and turned Victor Hale's last words over in her mind, like a stone she'd found in the road. That might be nothing or might be something. Before long, he's going to have even less. It was the kind of thing you said when you already had a plan. It wasn't a wish. It was a schedule. She didn't know enough about the valley yet to know what it meant specifically, but she knew the shape of it. She'd seen that shape before, in other places, in other men. The particular geometry of someone who had decided that your existence was an inconvenience to be managed. She made herself close her eyes. She made herself breathe slow. Tomorrow was still a workday. Fear could wait. The 1-week trial became 2 weeks without either of them officially saying so. It happened the way most things happened between people who were too practical for ceremony. The week ended, no one mentioned it, and the following Monday Naomi was up before dawn the same as always. And Silas came downstairs to hot coffee and the smell of something baking, and they looked at each other across the kitchen in the particular way of two people who have reached an agreement without a single word being said about it. He started paying her on Fridays. It wasn't much, he'd told her that honestly from the start, but it was regular, and it was real, and the first Friday she counted it out on the kitchen table after he'd gone back to the barn. She sat with her hands flat on the worn wood and felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. Not safety. She was too careful to call it that. Something smaller and more specific. The feeling of having earned a thing. Of the distance between where she'd been and where she was being measured in something other than loss. Lydia, meanwhile, had effectively adopted the ranch. By the end of the second week, she had named all 4 of the ranch horses. Hester she already knew, and the others became Duke, Pepper, and inexplicably, Gerald, and had developed a working relationship with Deke the ranch hand based on the exchange of information. Lydia asked Deke questions, and Deke, a weathered man of around 60 who had the conversational instincts of a fence post, answered them in single syllables that Lydia then interpreted with a creativity that probably exceeded what Deke had intended. But he never told her to go away. That, Naomi suspected, was as close to affection as Deke got. It was Deke who first told Naomi something concrete about Victor Hale. He found her one afternoon patching the gap she'd discovered along the back fence line. She'd been working her way through a mental list of things that needed doing, methodical and quiet about it. And he stood there a minute before saying anything, the way he always did, like speech was an investment he wanted to be sure about first. "You had a visitor," he said. Not a question. Naomi kept her hands on the fence wire. "Mr. Hale came by." Deke was quiet again. Then, "What'd he say?" "He offered me work." She paused. "I turned it down." Deke looked off toward the tree line at the north edge of the property. He had a way of looking at the middle distance when he was deciding how much to say. "Hale wants this land," he said finally. Naomi stopped working. She looked at him. "He's been wanting it a while," Deke continued, in the careful rhythm of a man releasing information one careful piece at a time. "Silas won't sell. Hale don't take well to know." He picked up a fence staple from the ground near his boot, turned it over in his fingers. "Usually when he wants something, he just applies pressure till it gives." "What kind of pressure?" Deke shrugged, but it was a knowing shrug. "Dries up the cattle buyers, says a word to the grain merchant. Nothing you can prove is him, but it adds up. He's patient." He dropped the staple back in the dirt. 6 years Silas has been holding out. Hale's been waiting 6 years. You showing up, that might have moved something. "I moved something," Naomi said slowly, "by turning him down." "By existing here," Deke said, and walked back toward the barn. She stayed at the fence a while longer after he left. The wind was coming from the northwest, which meant more cold by evening. She could feel it at the back of her neck, the specific cold of Montana November that was less like weather and more like a decision the landscape was making about you. She thought, "I walked into something I didn't know was here." And then, almost immediately, she thought, "That doesn't change what I do tomorrow morning." That, she told Silas that night. Not the full conversation with Deke. She wasn't sure how Silas would feel about his ranch hand sharing that particular history. But the visit itself, what Victor had said, the shape of the threat under the offer. She told him plainly, the way she did everything, sitting across the kitchen table from him, with her coffee cup in her hands and her eyes on his face. He listened without moving, that stillness again. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that she almost said something just to fill it, and she was glad she didn't, because when he finally spoke, what he said was not what she expected. "He came to the back of the house," Silas said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." "When I was out on the north pasture." "Yes." He set his coffee down. He looked at the table. Something was working in his expression that wasn't quite anger. It was older and more controlled than anger. It was the look of a man adding something up that he'd been counting for a long time. "He's done this before," Naomi said. Not a question either. "He has a way of talking to people when I'm not around," Silas said. "The grain merchant in town, the man I buy lumber from, little conversations here and there. They stop extending me credit, stop filling orders on time. Nothing you can walk up to a man and call a lie." He picked up his coffee again but didn't drink it. "Mrs. Pruitt, my housekeeper, she stopped coming about 6 weeks before you showed up. She didn't say why. She just stopped." Naomi felt that land somewhere in her chest. Not pity. She didn't think Silas would want pity, and she wouldn't have known how to offer it anyway. Something more like the recognition of a pattern she'd seen in another form. "He told me you'd have less before long," she said. Silas looked at her then. Really looked at her, in the direct way he mostly avoided. "He's probably right," Silas said. "Unless something changes." The kitchen was quiet. Outside the wind had picked up, and somewhere on the roof a loose shingle was ticking against the frame in a slow, irregular rhythm. "What would have to change?" Naomi asked. Silas was quiet for a long time. "I'd have to stop being the only one standing in the way," he said finally. "Hale's got influence because nobody pushes back. Everybody's afraid of what he'll do to their business. If enough people stopped being afraid at the same time," he shook his head slightly. "But people don't usually stop being afraid at the same time. That's what he counts on." Naomi looked at him. "Do you have neighbors you trust?" "Some." "Have you talked to them about this?" Silas looked away. "It's not—" He stopped. "It's not what?" "It's not something I've been in the habit of doing," he said, and the way he said it told her the rest. The 6 years alone on this ranch, the particular pride of a man who'd learned to need very little from anyone, the way asking for help felt too close to losing. She understood that. She understood it completely. She had walked in cold and near starving and asked this man for a job rather than for charity, Because there was a version of needing something that kept your spine intact and a version that didn't, and the difference mattered more than the need itself. But she also knew something else. She'd been learning it, in fact, for the past 3 weeks, though she hadn't put words to it yet. You can't win a long game alone, she said. Hale knows that. That might be why you haven't. Silas looked back at her. She thought for a moment he was going to disagree, or go quiet, or give her the polite version of telling her it was none of her business. I was a private man. He'd built his privacy the way you build a fence, deliberately, post by post, with intention. Instead, he said, "No, I suppose I haven't." No. It was a Thursday in December when Victor Hale came back. This time, he came to the front door, and this time, Silas was home. Naomi heard the horses and came to the doorway of the kitchen, drying her hands on a cloth. Lydia was in the main room with a book, and Naomi said quietly, "Stay here." And Lydia looked up and read something in her mother's face and stayed. Silas answered the door before Victor could knock a second time. Victor stood on the porch with 2 of his men behind him and his hat in his hand, a performance of civility that didn't reach his eyes. He smiled at Silas the way you smile at a problem you've already solved. "Silas," he said, "good to see you." "Victor." Silas did not move back from the door. "Wanted to stop by. Talk neighborly." Victor glanced past Silas into the house, not looking for anything specific, just making clear that he was looking. "I see you've got company." "I've got a housekeeper," Silas said. Victor tilted his head slightly. Interesting choice, given... He let that sit half a second. "Given things." "What things?" Victor smiled again. "I heard you had some trouble with your cattle buyer last season. Hennessy, wasn't it?" "I know Hennessy. Good man. Sensitive about risk." He let that settle too. "I also heard the Whitmore mill is backed up till March. That's going to make spring fencing slow." Silas looked at him without expression. "What do you want, Victor?" "I want to help you out," Victor said, and he made it sound almost warm. "You're sitting on 60 acres of prime valley land that you're managing alone. I've got the resources to develop it right, make it productive, make it profitable. I've offered you fair value." "You've offered me half of what it's worth," Silas said. Victor's smile held. "Markets change. The offer I made last spring is better than what I'd make today." He paused. "And today's better than what I'd make in the spring." There it was. Not a threat exactly. A forecast. The kind of forecast only someone who controlled the weather could make. From the kitchen doorway, Naomi watched Silas's jaw tighten. She watched him hold whatever was in him down, the way you hold something that wants to come up. He was a man who did not act from anger. She'd seen that in the 3 weeks she'd been here, the control of him, the particular discipline of someone who had learned that fast reactions cost more than slow ones. But she also watched Victor watching him, and she saw what Victor saw. A man alone, weighing the math, feeling the ground under him softer than it was last year. She stepped out of the kitchen doorway, not all the way to the door, just into the main room, visible, drying her hands on the cloth still, like she had somewhere to be, and this was just a room she was passing through. Victor's eyes moved to her. Something shifted in them, the calculation running again. "Mrs. Carter," he said, the way you acknowledge a piece on a board. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I hope Silas is treating you well." "He's a fair employer." She folded the cloth. "I'm staying." Victor looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked back at Silas. "Think on it," he said pleasantly. "My door's open." He put his hat back on and left. Silas closed the door. He stood with his hand on the door frame for a moment, his back to the room. When he turned around, Naomi was still standing there, and Lydia had come in from the main room and was standing in the middle of the floor, looking between the 2 adults with the focused attention she applied to everything she didn't understand yet. "Is that the man from before?" Lydia asked her mother. "Yes," Naomi said. "He has a mean voice," Lydia said matter-of-factly. "It sounds nice, but it's mean underneath." Silas looked at the child. Something crossed his face that was almost a smile, but landed somewhere sadder. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's about right." The following week, 3 things happened. The first was that Jonas Whitmore from the mill sent word that he couldn't fill Silas's lumber order till April, at the earliest, 2 months past what he'd originally promised, past what Silas needed for the spring fencing repair along the north pasture. The message came with an apology that felt like a form letter, and Silas read it at the kitchen table and set it down without comment. And Naomi didn't ask, but filed it away with everything else she was filing. The second was that a woman from town came to the ranch. Her name was Helen Marsh, and she was the wife of one of the smaller ranchers in the valley, a man named Cal Marsh, who ran about 40 head on a property about 3 miles northeast. Helen was somewhere in her 40s with a direct way of speaking and the permanently work-reddened hands of a woman who'd never hired anyone to do what she could do herself. She arrived on a Tuesday morning while Silas was out, tied her horse at the post, and walked up to the door with the specific confidence of someone who had decided something on the way over and wasn't planning to be talked out of it. Naomi answered the door. Helen looked her up and down with the frank assessment that women on the frontier applied to each other. Not unkind, just efficient. "You're her," Helen said. "The widow Boone hired." "Naomi Carter," Naomi said. "Helen Marsh. Can I come in?" Naomi stepped back from the door. Helen sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and got to the point inside of 2 minutes, which Naomi respected enormously. "Cal heard that Hale came here twice," Helen said, "and that you turned him down the first time, yourself." "That's right." Helen wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "We've been watching Hale run people out of this valley for 4 years. The Dreer family. You wouldn't know them. They were north of here. Sold out 2 winters ago after Hale made it, so none of the merchants in town would extend them credit. They had 3 children, loaded up a wagon in February." She paused. "The Connell family, the year before that. Same thing, different shape." Naomi was quiet, listening. "Most people see it happening and they think it's not their business," Helen continued. "Or they think if they keep their heads down, Hale won't look their direction. Cal and I—" She stopped for a moment, and something behind her directness shifted, something older and more tired. "We've been keeping our heads down a long time. We've got a boy. We think about keeping what we've built." "That's reasonable," Naomi said. "It is," Helen agreed. "And it's also how he keeps winning." She looked at Naomi. "I heard what you said to him, that you're staying." "I am." "You're not afraid of him?" Naomi considered the honest answer, which was that she was afraid of plenty of things, including Victor Hale, but that fear had never been a useful compass for her, and she'd mostly stopped navigating by it. "I'm more afraid of what happens if I leave," she said. Helen looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, with a finality that suggested some internal debate had just resolved itself. "Cal wants to talk to Silas," she said. "About a few things. About whether some of the ranchers in this valley ought to be having a different kind of conversation than the one they've been having." Naomi felt something turn over quietly in her chest. Not excitement exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular feeling of a situation shifting. "I'll tell him," she said. The third thing that happened that week was smaller than the other 2, but in the way that small things sometimes are, it landed heaviest. Lydia got sick. Not terribly. Not the kind of sick that meant danger, just the ordinary fever and sore throat of a child who'd been spending too many hours in cold barn air while she interrogated Gerald the horse about his feelings. Naomi knew it immediately the morning it happened, the way mothers know things, the particular quality of a child's breathing before they've even opened their eyes. She kept Lydia in bed, brought her broth, sat with her through the morning, reading aloud from the one novel she'd brought in the suitcase, a battered copy of something she'd had since before she was married. The cover long gone, the pages soft from use. She was reading in the low voice she used for sick days when the bedroom door, which she'd left slightly open for air, shifted, and she looked up. Silas was standing in the hallway. He was holding something. It took her a moment to register what it was. A small tin cup of something steaming. He'd made tea. Not coffee, tea, which meant he'd gone to the back of the pantry where she'd organized the tins and found the one she'd labeled in her clear, careful handwriting and made tea specifically because he understood that was what you gave to someone with a fever. He stood in the doorway like he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to be there. "She sleeping?" he said quietly. "She just drifted off," Naomi said. He held out the tin. Naomi stood carefully, not waking Lydia, and took it from him in the hallway. Their hands were close for a moment, not touching, just close. And she was aware of it in the specific way you become aware of something when your life has been, for a long time, very careful about distance. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He looked past her at Lydia, small in the bed, one hand curled under her cheek. "She'll be all right," he said. "It's just a cold. She'll be loud again by Saturday." Something moved in his face. Not humor exactly, something more careful than that. "Good," he said, and went back down the hall. Naomi stood in the doorway with the warm tin in her hands and listened to his footsteps on the stairs, and felt, with the particular clarity that only comes to people who have been paying close attention, that something in this house had shifted. Not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories, all at once and obvious. The way things actually shift, slow and almost invisible. And then one day you look up and realize you are not where you were, and you cannot point to the exact moment you moved. She didn't name it. She was too careful for that, and too tired, and too honest with herself about how much of her life right now depended on staying clear-eyed about what things were and what they weren't. But she held the warmth of that tin cup in both hands and went back to sit beside her daughter, and she was aware, quietly, carefully aware, that for the first time in a very long time, she was not entirely alone in a difficulty. Cal Marsh came to the ranch on Saturday. Lydia was, as predicted, loud again. She was on the porch, wrapped in a blanket she'd dragged off the bed, explaining to Deke why Gerald had probably caught her cold and whether horses could transmit illness across a distance of several yards. And Deke was maintaining his characteristic silence while absorbing this theory when Cal Marsh rode up with Helen beside him. Cal was a quiet man, like most of the men in this valley seemed to be, as if the land itself required a certain economy of speech. He shook Silas's hand at the gate, and they went inside, and Naomi put coffee on and then made herself busy in the other room because this was between them, and she was careful about the lines between what was hers and what wasn't. But the walls were thin, and she wasn't trying hard not to hear. What she heard was 40 minutes of conversation, low and careful, circling the same territory from different angles. What Hale had done to the Dreers, what he'd done to the Connells, what he was doing now to Silas in small ways that accumulated. Cal's brother-in-law in the next valley had seen the same pattern 3 years ago and had sold before it got worse. And Cal had always told himself it wouldn't happen here, and the honest truth was, he'd been wrong about that. "There are others who feel the same way," Cal said. "The Peterson family, the 2 Archer brothers on the south pasture, maybe 4 or 5 more who won't say it out loud yet, but would if someone stood up first." "And if someone stands up first," Silas said, "Hale goes after them." "Yes," Cal said, "he does." Silence. "But if 6 people stand up at the same time," Cal said carefully, "it's harder to go after all of them at once." Another silence, longer this time. "He'll try," Silas said. "He'll try," Cal agreed. "But he's been doing things one at a time because we let him, because everybody decided it was someone else's problem until it was their own." His voice had an edge in it now that it hadn't had before. The edge of a man speaking to something he'd been sitting on for too long. "I've got a boy who's going to inherit that ranch. I'd like him to inherit a valley where one man doesn't run everything." Naomi stopped pretending to be busy. She stood in the kitchen with her hands still and listened. Silas said, after a long pause, "I'd need to know who's actually in before I say anything to Hale." "I'll find out," Cal said. "Give me 2 weeks." "All right." The sound of chairs, the sound of men standing, and then Cal said, almost as an afterthought, "The widow Carter. She turned him down herself." "She did," Silas said. "Helen said she was—" Cal seemed to be choosing the word. "Steady." A pause, and then Silas said something Naomi had to hold very still to hear clearly. "She's the steadiest person I've met in a long time." She heard them move toward the door. She heard the door open, and the cold air from outside pushed through the gap all the way into the kitchen. She heard Lydia outside saying something that made Cal Marsh laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and Helen's voice answering her. Naomi pressed her back against the kitchen wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed. "Steady," she thought. He said steady. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. She was a practical woman. She knew what the situation was and what it wasn't. She knew she was an employee in a temporary arrangement in the middle of a problem she hadn't known about when she arrived. And she knew that the warmth she sometimes felt in this kitchen in the evenings was the warmth of circumstance, not guarantee. And she knew all of that with the clear, unflinching part of her that had been running her life since Thomas died. But she was also a woman who had been told she'd never make it through the winter, at 6 different doors by 6 different people before she'd knocked on this one. And she was still here. She pushed off the wall, straightened her shoulders, and went to start something for dinner because the Marsh family was still outside, and the hospitable thing was to invite them to stay. And because whatever happened next, whatever Cal's 2 weeks turned up, whatever Victor Hale decided to do about a widow who wouldn't leave and a cowboy who wouldn't sell, there was still a meal to make and a child to feed and work to be done. She had always found that work helped. Not because it solved things, it never solved things, but it kept your hands from shaking while things got solved. Cal Marsh was a man who kept his word, and he did it in exactly 14 days. He came back on a Thursday morning in the second week of December with his hat in his hand and mud on his boots, and the look of a man who had covered a lot of ground in a short time. Silas was in the barn when he arrived, and Naomi watched from the kitchen window as the two men stood outside near the fence and talked for a while in the particular way of men who have something real to say and are taking their time saying it. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She could read the shape of the conversation in the way Silas's posture changed, the slow shift from arms crossed to hands in pockets, which for Silas was the equivalent of leaning forward. When they came inside, Cal sat down at the kitchen table and laid it out plainly. 5 families. The Petersons, the 2 Archer brothers, the widow Fontaine who ran the small sheep operation on the east side of the valley, and a younger couple named Briggs, who'd only been in Willow Ridge 2 years but had already had one run-in with Victor Hale over a water rights question that had never been formally resolved. 5 families who had said, when Cal asked them carefully and privately, that they were tired, that they'd been tired for a while, that if someone was willing to stand first, they wouldn't be standing alone. The widow Fontaine surprised me, Cal said, wrapping his hands around his coffee. I thought she'd say no. She's been quiet about all of it, but she said, he paused, like he was getting the words right. She said she's been watching Hale for 3 years, and the only thing she's learned is that silence didn't protect the Drayers, and it didn't protect the Connells, and she wasn't going to wait around to find out if it protected her. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's 5 families. 6, counting yours. It's not enough to stop him financially, Silas said. He'll still have buyers. He'll still have merchants. No, Cal agreed. But it's enough to make noise. And noise is what he doesn't have a plan for, because nobody's ever made it. Naomi was at the counter, not pretending this time to be doing something else. She was just standing there listening, and neither man seemed to mind, which she noticed. What kind of noise? She asked. Cal looked at her. There's a cattlemen's meeting in Willow Ridge the second week of January. Most of the valley comes. Hale always comes. He uses it to shake hands and remind people who he is. He paused. If Silas stood up in that room and said plainly what Hale's been doing, and if those 5 families backed it, publicly, in front of everyone, it changes the picture. It changes the picture for Hale too, Silas said. He'll come after every one of them. He'll try, Cal said, the same thing he'd said 2 weeks ago. But Cal Peterson's got a cousin who buys cattle out of Billings. The Archers have been selling direct to a buyer in Helena for 2 years. They don't need Hale's contacts anymore. The Briggs family. He hesitated. Young Ed Briggs has a big mouth and no fear and knows every rancher in the next valley over. He's practically a newspaper. Something that might have been a dry, reluctant laugh moved across Silas's face and then disappeared. And you? Silas said. Cal looked at his coffee. Helen's been telling me for 2 years that if I didn't do something, I was going to have to live with what came from not doing something. She's usually right about that kind of thing. He looked up. I'm doing something. Silas looked at the table for a long time. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of wind against the window glass and the distant thump of Deke doing something in the barn. Naomi watched him work through it. She'd gotten better at reading him over the past weeks, the particular cadences of his silences, which ones were him resisting and which ones were him arriving. January, Silas said finally. January, Cal confirmed. Silas looked at Naomi, not asking permission. He wasn't that kind of man, and she would have found it strange if he had been. But there was something in the look that included her, that acknowledged she was part of what was being decided, and she held that look steadily and gave a small nod. All right, Silas said. January. What? Word traveled the way. Word always traveled in small valleys. Not fast, but thorough. Within a week of Cal's visit, Naomi could feel it in the small interactions that made up the texture of life in Willow Ridge. When she went to the general store to pick up supplies, The man behind the counter, a wiry, careful man named Pettit, who had always been politely distant, asked how things were going out at the Boone Ranch in a way that was different from before. Not friendlier exactly, more attentive, like he was paying a different kind of attention to her answer. When she took Lydia to the small schoolhouse on the edge of town for the first time, a decision she and Silas had made together practically, because Lydia had been absorbing her mother's teaching with alarming speed and was running out of questions that Naomi could satisfyingly answer. The school teacher, a woman in her 30s named Miss Aldrich, had squeezed Naomi's hand at the door and said quietly, "I heard about you turning down Victor Hale. Twice." And then she'd said nothing else, just squeezed the hand and let it go, but the squeeze had said enough. Victor Hale heard things too. Of course he did. A man who had run a valley for years by controlling information didn't lose track of when information started moving in directions he hadn't arranged. He sent a man to the ranch in the 3rd week of December. Not himself this time. Just a man, one of the 3 who always seemed to be around him, arriving alone on a gray horse with a letter folded inside his coat that he handed to Naomi at the door with the blank expression of someone who has delivered messages for long enough that he stopped thinking about their contents. She read it at the kitchen table. Silas stood behind her and read it over her shoulder, which was a thing he did sometimes now, without seeming to notice he was doing it, and she'd stopped noticing that he was doing it. The letter was from Victor Hale, and it was written in the careful language of a man who had a lawyer somewhere nearby. It informed Silas that there were questions about the survey records for the northeast corner of the property, a boundary issue that Hale claimed had been improperly recorded in 1879, and that he was prepared to pursue this through the county land office if a mutually agreeable resolution could not be reached. The tone was regretful. The tone was the written equivalent of Victor Hale's smile, polished smooth, with something hard and cold underneath. Silas read it twice. Then he set it on the table. "He's manufactured a land dispute," Naomi said. "He manufactured one 3 years ago too," Silas said, "with the Connells. It took them 8 months and everything they had in lawyer fees before it got dismissed." Naomi looked at the letter. "Do you have the original survey records?" "Somewhere." "You need to find them." "I know." "Today," she said, not bossily, just accurately. He looked at her. "Today," he agreed. They spent 2 hours that afternoon going through the cedar trunk in the back of the bedroom that Silas used for important documents, which turned out to be organized with the particular chaos of a man who had always known where things were until he needed to show someone else. There were receipts, old correspondence, a deed from when Silas had first purchased the property in 1876, and eventually, in an envelope that had been used twice, the original address crossed out, the survey records, 1877, conducted by a county surveyor named Alton Marsh, who was, Naomi noted, almost certainly related to Cal. She said so. Silas confirmed it. "Cal's uncle. He's been dead 8 years. Can Cal access his records?" Silas blinked. "I hadn't thought of that. Would his estate have copies? His family?" Silas was quiet for a moment, and she could see the thought landing and spreading. "Cal's mother kept everything. She's still alive. She's 81 years old, and she lives in the house Cal grew up in, and she has not thrown anything away in her entire life." "Then Cal needs to talk to his mother," Naomi said. Silas looked at her with the expression that he sometimes got, not quite surprise, but something in the neighborhood of it, like she'd shown him a door in a wall he'd been looking at for years. "You're good at this," he said. "At what?" "At seeing the next step." She looked down at the survey records in her hand. "I'm good at not having any other option," she said honestly. "It makes you look harder." Christmas came the way Christmas comes to working ranches, acknowledged but not indulged, marked by small gestures rather than ceremony. Naomi made a proper dinner. She'd been saving things for it. A small luxury here, and the result was a table that looked more like a table should look, and less like the functional necessity it usually was. There was a cloth on it. There was a candle. There was a roasted chicken and roasted root vegetables, and a pie she'd made from preserved peaches that Deke had inexplicably had 3 jars of in the back of the bunkhouse and had handed over with the air of a man relieved to have them gone. Deke ate dinner with them. This had been Naomi's doing. She'd simply set 4 places, and no one had questioned it, and Deke had come inside with clean hands and his hair flat from water and sat in the chair nearest the door with the careful posture of a man unaccustomed to being at a table with other people. He ate in dedicated silence, which was exactly what everyone had expected. But when Lydia asked him what his favorite Christmas memory was, because Lydia treated silences as problems to be solved, he'd thought about it seriously for a long moment and then said, "My dog. Had a dog named Ray. He used to open his own presents." And then he'd gone back to eating, and Lydia had treated this revelation with the gravity it deserved and spent the next 20 minutes asking follow-up questions about Ray. Silas had watched all of this from across the table with something in his face that Naomi couldn't fully name and didn't try to. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was the expression of someone sitting in a warm room after a long time in the cold, not quite sure yet if they should trust it. She had gotten him something for Christmas. A small thing. She couldn't afford large things, and she'd thought carefully about whether it was appropriate at all, because the line between the situation being what it was and the situation being something else was a line she was deliberate about. But she'd found it at Pettit's general store, and it had seemed right, so she'd bought it. It was a pair of work gloves. Good leather, properly sized for large hands. Not the cheap kind that cracked in 3 weeks. Practical, justified, the kind of thing you could give an employer without any complication. She gave them to him after dinner, matter-of-factly, while Lydia was occupied with showing Deke a drawing she'd made of Gerald the horse. Naomi set them on the table beside his coffee. "Your others are worn through," she said, by way of explanation. He picked them up and looked at them. He looked at them longer than gloves required. "Thank you," he said. "It's practical," she said, which was either the truest or least true thing she'd said all evening, and she wasn't entirely sure which. He reached into the pocket of his coat. He hadn't hung it up yet, had come in from one last check of the barn before dinner and sat down still wearing it, and set something on the table beside her coffee cup. It was a book. Small, cloth-bound, the kind of quality that wasn't expensive but was clearly chosen rather than grabbed. She picked it up. It was a collection of essays, natural history, the American West, the kind of writing that asked questions about the world without pretending to have all the answers. She looked at him. "I noticed you finished your other one," he said, nodding toward the battered novel she'd been reading to Lydia. 3 times. She had. She'd thought no one noticed. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and picked up his coffee, and that was the full extent of it, but it sat with her longer than it had any particular right to. The new year came cold and clear, and 3 days into January, Victor Hale made his next move. It didn't come from him directly. It never did, which was part of what made him effective. It came through the county land office in the form of a formal notice that the boundary dispute on the northeast corner of the Boone property had been logged and would require a hearing. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of February. In the meantime, there was a question about whether that section of land could be used for spring grazing while the matter was unresolved. Silas read this notice and was quiet for a long time. Naomi read it and then went to find Cal Marsh, because the timing was not a coincidence. The cattlemen's meeting in Willow Ridge was in 2 weeks, and she understood now that Hale had filed this notice specifically to have it hanging over Silas's head when he walked into that room. A man fighting a land dispute looked different than a man making a stand. He looked desperate. He looked like someone with something to lose, rather than someone with something to say. She rode to the Marsh Ranch herself, on Hester, who was steady on winter roads and had a philosophical acceptance of cold weather that Naomi had come to appreciate deeply. She'd ridden horses before, but not extensively, but Thomas had kept 2, and she hadn't forgotten the fundamentals. Helen Marsh met her at the door. "I already heard," Helen said before Naomi could speak. "Cal's mother had the records. We found them 2 nights ago." Naomi felt the air come back into her lungs. "You have them." 3 copies. Alton made 3 copies of every survey he did. 1 for the county, 1 for the landowner, and 1 for his own records. Helen stepped back from the door. "Come inside. Cal's been waiting to talk to Silas." What followed was 10 days of the particular tension that comes when everyone knows something is coming and no one can make it come faster. The 5 families who had agreed to stand with Silas confirmed it again, each in their own way. The Petersons by way of a brief note delivered by their eldest son. The Archers in person, on a Sunday afternoon when both brothers rode over together and sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and said very little but left no ambiguity about where they'd be standing on the day. Young Ed Briggs came with his wife, a small, fierce woman from Ohio named Clara, who shook Naomi's hand like she meant it, and told her she'd heard about the morning with the hatchet and the hired men and that she personally found it inspiring, which made Naomi laugh for the first time in what felt like several weeks. The widow Fontaine sent a letter. It was 3 sentences long and absolutely clear. What was less clear was Silas. Not about the meeting. He was going, he'd said so. He wasn't a man who went back on a word. But as the date got closer, something tightened in him that Naomi noticed without commenting on. He was sleeping poorly. She could hear him sometimes in the night, the floorboards on his side of the house moving when they should have been quiet. He was shorter with Deke, not unkindly but briefly, in the way of a man whose mind was full. One evening he sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes with a cup of coffee that he didn't drink, and when she finally asked him what he was thinking about, he looked up like she'd pulled him out of deep water. "Last time I stood up in a room and said something that needed saying," he told her, "it was at my own wife's funeral. I said her name and I couldn't finish the sentence." He picked up the cold coffee. "I'm not a man who does well in front of people." Naomi considered that. "You don't have to be well," she said. "You just have to say the true thing." "What if I say it wrong?" "Say it anyway." She met his eyes. People can hear the difference between someone performing and someone telling the truth, even when the truth isn't pretty, especially then. He looked at her for a moment. "You've thought about this." "I think about most things." "I've noticed," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not irony, not performance, that made her look down at her own cup until the moment passed. The cattlemen's meeting was held in the largest room of the Willow Ridge Town Hall, a building that served as courthouse, meeting space, and occasional refuge for anyone the weather was after. It smelled like wood smoke and old paper and the accumulated presence of decades of arguments and agreements. Naomi went. She had not planned to go. She'd thought about it and decided that it was not her place. This was Silas's fight, and Cal's, and the Valley's, and she was employed help at a ranch that was one part of all of it. She'd been careful about that line the whole time. She'd been careful about a lot of lines. But on the morning of the meeting, as Silas was pulling on his coat at the door, Lydia appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, with her hair in 2 plaits she'd done herself, not very evenly, and said, "Is Mama going?" Silas looked up at Naomi. Naomi opened her mouth to say she wasn't. Silas said, "She should." She looked at him. "You've been part of this since before I knew it was starting," he said. "You ought to be there when it finishes." There were 2 things about that sentence that she turned over carefully later, that he'd said when it finishes, not if, and that he'd said you've been part of this, not you helped, or you've been useful. Part of this. She got her coat. Victor Hale was already in the room when they arrived. He was standing near the front with 2 of his men and talking to a cattle buyer from the northern part of the county with the relaxed confidence of a man attending a social event that existed for his benefit. He saw Silas come in and something crossed his face. A recalibration, small and quick, the way a man adjusts when a card lands he didn't expect. He saw Naomi behind Silas and the recalibration happened again. The room filled. It was a good turnout. 40, maybe 45 men and a handful of women, the full cross-section of the valley's working ranches. Naomi recognized faces from town, from the store, from the descriptions Cal and Helen had given her over the past weeks. She stood near the back wall with Helen Marsh beside her and watched people find their seats. Cal caught her eye from across the room and gave her a small nod. The Archers were there. The Petersons. Ed Briggs, large and cheerful-looking, already talking to someone near the door, with the animated energy of a man who genuinely enjoyed people. His wife Clara stood beside him looking like she could win a fistfight if circumstances required. The widow Fontaine sat in the second row, small and upright, her hands folded in her lap, watching the proceedings with the patient attention of someone who had already made every decision she was going to make and was simply waiting for the moment to carry them out. The meeting ran through its ordinary business first. Grazing schedules, a question about the road between the northern properties, a complaint about the county surveyor's timeline on a separate matter. Naomi watched Victor during all of this. He participated smoothly, asked a question here, offered a comment there, the model of a civic-minded landowner. His men sat behind him and said nothing. Then the meeting chair, an older man named Harris, who wore the authority of long tenure lightly, asked if there was other business. Silas stood up. The room shifted. Naomi felt it more than saw it. The particular change in the air of a room when something is about to happen and everyone present knows it. Hale went still. Silas was not a natural speaker. Naomi had known this going in, and she'd thought about telling him it didn't matter, and then she'd decided that showing him was better than telling him. And so she'd said nothing additional beyond what she'd already said. And now she stood at the back wall and watched him stand in front of this room with his hat in his hands and begin to talk. He didn't perform. He didn't preamble. He said, in the plain, direct voice of a man reporting facts he'd witnessed himself, that Victor Hale had been methodically working to acquire his land for 6 years, that the means used included pressuring merchants and buyers to cut off his credit and business, that Hale had sent men to his property to intimidate his household, and that the land dispute currently filed against him involved a boundary that had been correctly surveyed in 1877 and could be demonstrated as such with 3 copies of the original record. He laid it out in about 4 minutes. It wasn't elegant. He lost his place once, stopped, found it again. His voice was flat in places where someone with more practice might have put emphasis. But it was true, and it was clear, and every word of it was recognizable to everyone in that room as something they had seen operating in the valley for years and had not spoken aloud. The silence when he finished was the kind that means everyone is breathing carefully. Then Victor Hale stood up. He was good at this. He was better at this than Silas was, and Naomi knew it, and from the look on Cal's face he knew it too. Hale had the smooth delivery of a man who had managed public situations for a long time, and what he said was exactly what you'd expect. It was regrettable that a private business dispute had been brought into this form. He had nothing but respect for Silas Boone. The land question was a legitimate legal matter that he was pursuing through entirely proper channels, and he hoped that whatever misunderstanding existed between them could be resolved with good faith on both sides. Several people in the room visibly relaxed, the kind of relaxing that happens when someone makes a complicated thing sound simple. Naomi watched, and then Cal Marsh stood up. He said he wanted to add something, and Harris acknowledged him, and Cal said, in the same plain manner as Silas, that he had personal knowledge of 2 families in this valley who had been driven from their land through a pattern identical to what Silas had described, and that he had in his possession a statement from one member of the Dreyer family, now living in Billings, documenting the sequence of events that had preceded their sale. He said that he had spoken to 5 other families in the valley who had direct experience with similar pressure, and that he was prepared to name them if it was useful. He named them: the Petersons, the Archers, the Widow Fontaine, the Briggs family. Each one, as their name was said, gave some form of visible assent, a nod, a raised hand, a simple straightening in their seat. The room was no longer relaxed. Victor Hale's face had gone to something that wasn't his prepared expression. He was looking at the room the way a man looks at a board game when he realizes the other player has had a strategy all along that he completely missed. "These are serious accusations," the meeting chair Harris said carefully. "They're documented facts," Cal said. "I have the Dreyer statement in my coat right now if anyone wants to read it." 3 people raised their hands. Us. The meeting didn't end cleanly. Nothing like this ever did. There was a lot of talk afterward, careful, circling, the kind of talk that happens when a room full of people are revising their understanding of something they thought they knew. Hale had allies there, men who owed him favors or feared his reach, and they spoke in careful defenses that sounded increasingly hollow as the hour went on. The county buyer from the north was visibly uncomfortable. The grain merchant from town, who had never said a word against Hale in 20 years, sat in the back and said nothing, which was its own statement. Silas stood near the wall after it was over and talked to people who came to him in 1s and 2s, men and women who had things to say that they apparently felt safer saying in a smaller group than in the meeting itself. Naomi watched him do this and noticed something. He was better at this than he'd been at the speaking. One-on-one, in the quiet conversations along the edges of the room, he was direct and real, and people responded to it the way they respond to anything that doesn't feel like it's trying to sell them something. Hale left before it was officially over. He walked out with his men and his excellent coat and the specific controlled stride of a man who intends to be seen as unbothered, and Naomi watched him go. Clara Briggs appeared beside her. "He's going to do something now," Clara said quietly. "I know," Naomi said. "Ed says he's got lawyers in Helena and at least one county official in his pocket. Probably. Are you scared? Naomi thought about it. The honest answer was that she was scared and had been scared for most of the past 2 months and was going to remain scared, because that was the accurate response to the situation. The difference was what you did with it. Yes, she said. Clara looked at her with something like relief. Good, me too. Ed isn't, which is its own problem. Naomi almost smiled. Across the room, Silas was finishing a conversation with an older rancher she didn't know, and as the older man walked away, Silas looked up and found her in the room with the immediate directness of someone who had gotten used to knowing where a particular person was. He held her eyes for a moment. She gave him a small nod. He nodded back. Helen Marsh appeared at her elbow. That went about as well as it could have gone, Helen said. It's not over, Naomi said. No, Helen agreed, but it started. Outside, the January cold was waiting. Naomi pulled her coat tighter and stepped out of the warmth of the hall into the night air, and she thought, we did a thing today. It wasn't enough yet. It was going to get harder before it got easier. Hale was not a man who lost gracefully, and they had not yet won anything. They had only, finally, said the true thing out loud in a room full of people who had needed to hear it. But something had moved. She could feel it the way she'd felt the temperature that first night on Silas's porch. Not as a dramatic shift, but as a change in the air, a change in the direction something was going. She stood in the cold and breathed it in. And somewhere behind her, the door of the town hall opened and closed, and she heard Silas's boots on the step, and she did not have to turn around to know it was him. He fell into step beside her without a word, and they walked to the horses together through the cold dark of that January night, and neither of them said anything for a while, and that silence was not uncomfortable in the way that silences used to be between them. It was the silence of two people who had just done something difficult together and were still inside it. Silas untied Hester and handed Naomi the reins. She'd ridden the mare to town, and he'd taken the younger gelding, Duke, and now Duke was stamping in the cold with the theatrical impatience of a horse who felt strongly about barns. You did well in there, Naomi said. Silas made a sound that was not quite agreement. I lost my place. You found it again. Cal did most of the actual work. Cal did his part, she said. You did yours. Those aren't the same thing, and they're both necessary. He looked at her over Hester's back. The lamplight from the hall behind them was just enough to see his face, and his face was doing the thing it sometimes did, working through something he hadn't decided yet whether to say. I haven't stood in front of people and said a hard thing since Clara's funeral, he said. I told you that. You did. I thought it would feel the same. She waited. It didn't, he said. He pulled Duke's reins loose from the post and checked the cinch the way men who grew up with horses always check cinches, by habit, without thinking. I don't know what that means yet. Naomi thought she might know. She thought she might know several things that she was being very careful not to say yet, because being careful was what had kept her moving through the past year and a half, and she was not ready to stop being careful, not even for something that was starting to feel like it might deserve something different. It means you're not the same person you were at that funeral, she said. That's not a bad thing. He considered that. Then he mounted Duke, and she mounted Hester, and they rode home through the cold, clear night with the stars absolutely enormous overhead, the way they only get when the air is that cold and that still, and neither of them said another word the whole way, and it was one of the most companionable silences Naomi Carter had experienced in years. Hale moved fast. Faster than she'd expected, though in retrospect she shouldn't have been surprised. Men like him had contingency plans the way other men had tools, kept ready, within reach, because experience had taught them they'd need them. Within 4 days of the cattlemen's meeting, the formal complaint about the land boundary had been upgraded. A county assessor arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning, not the regular county assessor, a different one, a younger man named Prewitt, who had the careful eyes of someone conscious of who was watching him, and informed Silas that in light of the disputed boundary, a formal resurvey would be conducted, and that the section in question was to be considered inactive pending the outcome. No grazing, no fence repair, no improvements. Silas stood on the porch and received this information with a stillness that Naomi recognized by now as the controlled version of something that was not still at all. How long? Silas said. The survey can be scheduled for... Prewitt consulted a paper. March 15th. That's 2 months. The county process? That's the start of calving season, Silas said flatly. That section has the best grass on this property. Prewitt looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a man doing a job he understands is wrong but is rationalized into administrative language. I understand that, Mr. Boone. The county process doesn't account for it. No, Silas said. It doesn't. Prewitt left. Silas stood on the porch for a long moment after the man's horse disappeared down the road, and then he came inside and sat at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the wood and stared at the middle distance. Naomi put coffee on. She didn't say anything yet. She'd learned the rhythm of him well enough to know when talking helped and when it was better to let him arrive somewhere on his own before she said a word. He arrived after about 5 minutes. He's trying to cost me a season, Silas said. If I can't graze that northeast section in spring, I'm down by, he calculated, a third of my usual cattle rotation, maybe more. I know. It'll show in the fall numbers. If the fall numbers are bad, the buyers have reason to offer less. I know. And if I'm taking less from buyers, I'm closer to the place where selling starts to look like a rational decision. He looked at her. It's the same thing he did to the drayers, just slower. Naomi sat down across from him. Cal has those survey records. The county doesn't care about Cal's survey records right now. They care about the formal complaint and the process has been arranged to take until March. Then we need to make the process move faster, she said. The county doesn't move faster. Not for one person, Naomi said. But what about for a formal counterfiling with original documentation submitted jointly by multiple landowners who can demonstrate a pattern of fraudulent complaints? She met his eyes. How much does the county ignore a thing if 7 families sign their names to it? Silas stared at her. I'm not a lawyer, she said. I don't know if that's exactly how it works, but I know that a complaint from one person looks different than a complaint from 7. And I know that Cal has documentation, and I know that Ed Briggs knows every rancher in the next valley and has a big mouth and no fear. Silas was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this since the meeting. I've been thinking about it since I read the letter he sent in December, she said. I just didn't want to say it until there was something specific to say it about. He looked at her for a long time. Not the quick, efficient looks they exchanged constantly now, the ones that had become a kind of shorthand between them, but something longer and more deliberate. Naomi, he said. Just her name. Nothing after it. She felt it anyway. The weight of the way he said it, the particular tone of it, the fact that he'd never said her name quite like that before. She looked at him, and she was very careful about her own face, and she said nothing. He looked down at his coffee. I'll ride to Cal's today, he said. Good, she said. Oh, the joint counterfiling was Ed Briggs's idea, as it turned out. Or rather, Ed Briggs had already been thinking along the same lines independently, which was either reassuring or slightly alarming depending on your perspective, and his wife Clara found it both simultaneously. They met at the Marsh Ranch on a Thursday evening. Silas, Cal, and Helen, both Archer brothers, young Ed and Clara Briggs, the widow Fontaine who had ridden 15 miles in January cold without appearing to consider it remarkable, and the Peterson family represented by the eldest son, Will, because his father had a bad leg that had been worse since November. 7 people around a table that wasn't quite big enough for all of them, with coffee and a lamp and a copy of the county land statutes that Cal had obtained from the town hall records, and which no one except possibly Cal had read before. Cal had read it twice and made notes in the margin in his careful handwriting. There's a provision, Cal said, spreading the document on the table. Section 14. If a formal land complaint can be demonstrated to be filed in bad faith, meaning the filer had knowledge that the claim was invalid at the time of filing, the county is required to expedite a dismissal hearing. Required, Silas said. The word is shall, Cal said. Not may. Shall. Can we demonstrate bad faith? This from Will Peterson, who had his father's directness and his mother's skeptical eyebrows. We can demonstrate that the boundary survey Hale is claiming is an error was correctly conducted by a licensed county surveyor in 1877, that 3 copies of that survey exist and are consistent with each other, and that the land office records in Helena contain the same data. Cal tapped the table. What we can't demonstrate directly is that Hale knew this when he filed, but a pattern of similar filings, There was one with the Dreers, said Helen. And the Connells, said the widow Fontaine quietly. I have a letter from Margaret Connell. She wrote to me after they left. She described a boundary dispute that was filed against their northeast corner. She paused. Their northeast corner. The room was quiet. He uses the same move, the elder Archer brother, Frank said. Same move, Cal confirmed. Different properties. Northeast corner, land office complaint, county assessor visit, scheduling delay into calving or planting season. That's a pattern. A documented pattern. He looked around the table. That's closer to demonstrating bad faith than you might think. Ed Briggs, who had been contained for an unusually long time, leaned forward. My cousin-in-law is a clerk at the Helena land office. Not a big man, not someone with authority, but he knows the filing procedures and he knows which regional superintendent is not on speaking terms with the county assessor's office right now over a completely separate jurisdictional dispute. He said this like a man presenting a gift. Administrative friction can be useful. Clara put her hand over her eyes briefly in the expression of a woman accustomed to her husband, then looked back up. What Ed means, she said, is that if this counterfiling lands on the right desk at the right time during an ongoing inter-office dispute, it may receive more attention than Hale expected. That's exactly what I mean, Ed said. Silas looked across the table at Cal. Can we put this together in time to matter? If everyone here contributes what they have, the documents, the letters, the specific dates and details, I can draft the filing in 2 weeks. 1 week, Naomi said. Everyone looked at her. She was sitting at the end of the table and had not said much, listening and assembling, and now she looked back at the room steadily. Hale didn't slow his timeline once this started, she said. Neither should we. 1 week. Whatever anyone has, it comes to Cal in 1 week. The filing goes in before the end of January. Cal looked at her, then at Silas, then back at the room. 1 week, he said. Nobody argued. The week was hard in the specific way that weeks are hard when they matter. Not dramatically, not in one clean crisis, but in the accumulated weight of many small difficult things done under pressure. Naomi spent most of it managing the ranch work alone because Silas was riding from one property to another, collecting statements and documents, and sitting at kitchen tables with people who needed to talk through what they were contributing before they were sure enough to contribute it. Deke picked up the extra work without being asked, which was the most eloquent thing Deke had done since the story of his dog Ray. Lydia, who was not unobservant for an 8-year-old, had registered the change in the house's atmosphere with the precision of a child who had grown up paying close attention to her mother's silences. One evening she appeared in the kitchen doorway while Naomi was working and said, "Is someone trying to take away this house?" Naomi put down what she was doing and looked at her daughter. "Someone is trying," she said. "We're trying harder." Lydia thought about this with the characteristic seriousness she applied to things that mattered. "I like it here," she said. "I know. I like Gerald." A pause. "And Deke and Silas." She said Silas's name the same way she said the others, matter-of-factly, without particular emphasis, which was somehow more meaningful than if she'd made it significant. "He listened to my whole theory about the rain clouds." "He did," Naomi said. "Most adults get a look," Lydia said, "like they're waiting for me to stop. He didn't get the look." Naomi looked at her daughter and felt something complicated move through her that she didn't try to organize. "Go finish your reading," she said. Lydia went. Naomi stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, and she thought about what her daughter had said with the uncomplicated directness of a child who had not yet learned to manage what she felt. He didn't get the look. She thought, neither do I anymore. And then she went back to work, because the filing needed to be ready in 4 days, and she was the one who could write clearly and quickly, and Cal had asked her to help him organize the drafted language. And there was still dinner to make, and the morning would come early. The counterfiling went to the county land office on a Friday at the end of January, delivered in person by Cal Marsh, and accompanied by a separate letter addressed to the regional superintendent in Helena, routed, by way of Ed Briggs's cousin-in-law's careful suggestion, through a particular administrative channel that happened to land in the middle of the jurisdictional dispute Ed had mentioned, which meant it got reviewed by someone who had a personal interest in demonstrating that the county assessor's office had overstepped its authority. It was not a clean victory. Nothing about any of this was clean. But within 10 days, a letter came back requiring the county assessor's office to to produce its documentation for the original complaint before any further survey scheduling could proceed. It was not a dismissal. It was a question. But it was a question asked in the direction of Victor Hale for the first time in years, and that question had 7 names attached to it. And the county land office had apparently found that 7 names asking the same question about the same pattern required a different kind of answer than one man's formal complaint against another. Silas read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else was up. Naomi came downstairs and found him there and poured coffee for both of them and sat down, and he pushed the letter across the table without saying anything and watched her read it. She read it. She set it down. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's different. Hale's going to push back." "He will." She wrapped her hands around her cup. Outside, the February light was coming in low and gray through the kitchen window, the specific light of a Montana winter morning that was neither warm nor welcoming, but was real and present and there. She had started to appreciate that quality of the light. She'd started to appreciate a lot of things that she hadn't had space to appreciate before. "Can I ask you something?" Silas said. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee, not at her, which meant it was something he was less sure about. "When you came here," he said, "the last door, you said you'd knock on one more door." She hadn't told him that. She hadn't told anyone that. "How did you know that?" "I didn't," he said. "I guessed. You had the look of someone who had made themselves a limit." He looked up then. "What were you going to do if I'd said no?" Naomi was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was that she'd had no plan, that she'd told herself she'd figure something else out, the way she always told herself, and that this time she'd been less sure than she'd ever been that the something else existed, that the last stretch of road before his gate had been the particular cold of a person walking toward the edge of what they had left. "I don't know," she said, which was the truest answer she could give. He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd been thinking about. "I almost didn't open the door," he said. "It was late. I didn't want trouble." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I'd gotten very good at not wanting things. It's easier, mostly." Naomi looked at him. "Then you were standing there," he said, "and you asked me for work and not for anything else, and I thought—" He stopped. "What?" she said quietly. "I thought, this person is not going to break. Whatever's happened to her, she is not going to break." He looked at her directly. "I hadn't been around that in a long time." The kitchen was very quiet. The light had shifted slightly, come up a degree. The particular movement of early morning light that you only notice in rooms where you've spent enough time to know how it usually falls. "Silas," she said. "I know," he said before she could continue. "I know what the situation is and what it isn't. I'm not asking you for anything." He looked back at his coffee. "I just wanted to say that, because I thought you should know what I saw when I opened the door." Naomi sat with that for a long moment. She sat with the careful part of herself that had been running everything for 18 months, the part that kept the accounts straight and the plans realistic and the distances measured. She sat with it, and she listened to it, and then she said quietly and precisely, "I see what I see when I look at you too." He looked up. She looked back at him without looking away. "I'm not asking you for anything either," she said. "I'm just saying it." Neither of them said anything else for a while. The morning light came up another degree. Outside, Deke began his habitual thump toward the barn, and somewhere in the house above them, Lydia turned over in her sleep with the small sound of a child redistributing herself. And the kitchen held all of it, the ordinary sounds and the ordinary light, and the 2 people at the table sitting inside something that had been building for months and had just been named, quietly, without ceremony, without any promise yet about what came next. Victor Hale's response to the county's question arrived, not as another legal document, but as a visit. He came alone this time. No men behind him, no performance of force. Just Hale on his horse, arriving at midday on a Saturday in early February, when the cold had gone a degree less brutal and the sky was the particular clear blue that makes winter look almost reasonable. He tied his horse at the gate, which was itself different, before he'd ridden through gates like they were already his, and he walked to the front door and knocked. Silas answered. Hale looked older than he had in January. Not much, but enough that Naomi, who was standing in the main room and could see him through the doorway, noticed it. The month had done something to him, not broken him. He wasn't the kind of man who broke easily, but adjusted him, recalibrated him towards something a little less certain. "Silas," he said. "Victor. I'd like to talk." Silas stepped back from the door. Hale came in and looked at the house with different eyes than he'd had before. Not the appraising eyes of someone assessing an acquisition, but the more ordinary eyes of a man sitting in someone else's kitchen. He sat at the table when Silas gestured toward the chair, and Naomi moved toward the stove to put the coffee on, and Hale watched her with an expression that was complicated in ways she'd need more time to fully read. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Hale." "I want to say something to you," he said. "If you'll let me." She turned from the stove. She waited. "I was wrong to come here the way I did the first time," he said. "To you specifically. That's not—" He stopped and started again. "I've done a lot of things in this valley by making the people around a problem into part of the problem. That's how you isolate someone." He said it with the flat directness of a man who has looked at his own behavior recently and hasn't entirely liked what he found. That was wrong. Naomi looked at him for a moment. She did not say it was fine. It wasn't fine. But she recognized the shape of what he was doing. Not performing remorse, or she didn't think so, but doing something harder, which was admitting a specific thing specifically. "Thank you for saying so," she said, and turned back to the coffee. What followed was 40 minutes of conversation that was nothing like any of the conversations that had preceded it. Hale talked to Silas not as an opponent working an angle, but as a man who had run the math and found it coming out differently than he'd expected. The counterfiling was real. The pattern documentation was real. The regional superintendent's involvement was real. And something else was real too, which Hale said with less comfort but more honesty than anything else. The valley had changed. "I thought it was temporary," he said. "People talk, then they go back to keeping their heads down. It's what they always do." "Not this time," Silas said. "No," Hale agreed. "Not this time." He was quiet for a moment. "That widow Fontaine, I never thought she'd—" He didn't finish the sentence. "She's been watching a long time," Silas said. Hale turned his coffee cup once in his hands. "I'm withdrawing the land complaint," he said. "I'll file with the county this week." Silas said nothing. "I'm not leaving the valley," Hale said. "I want to be clear about that. I still have property here. I still have business here. But I'm going to do it differently." He said the last part like a man reading from a document he'd written reluctantly. "I've already had conversations with the Dreyer family's representative in Billings about the price they received, about a possible adjustment." The room was quiet enough that Naomi could hear the wood settling in the stove. "That'll take lawyers," Silas said. "It will," Hale agreed. "I have lawyers." Silas looked at him across the table for a long moment. He wasn't forgiving him. Naomi could see that clearly. This was not the face of a man extending forgiveness or erasing a history. It was the face of a man deciding how to hold a complicated thing. "The land complaint is filed this week," Silas said. "This week. And the Whitmore mill fills my lumber order at the original price." Hale looked at him. "I'll speak to Jonas Whitmore." "You'll do more than speak. You'll make it right." A long pause. Then Hale said, "Yes." Silas nodded, one nod, short and final. "Then we'll see," he said, which was not forgiveness and not acceptance, but was the thing that comes before both of them, acknowledgement, the recognition that something had been said and would be held to. Hale left an hour later. He shook Silas's hand at the door. Silas took the handshake without warmth but without refusal. And he nodded to Naomi, and she nodded back, and he walked to his horse and rode down the road without looking back. Silas stood in the open doorway for a moment after he was gone. The cold came in around him. Naomi waited. "I don't trust him," Silas said. "Neither do I," she said, "but I trust the filing, and the 7 names on it." He closed the door. He turned around. And then something happened that had never happened before in this kitchen, or anywhere else that she'd seen it. Silas Boone laughed. Not a big laugh, not a performed one, just a short, sudden sound that came out of him like something released. The particular laugh of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just briefly put it down. "7 names," he said. 7 names, she confirmed. The land complaint was filed with the county on the following Wednesday. Naomi saw the confirmation herself because Cal brought it out to the ranch. An official withdrawal, processed, stamped, and recorded in the same ledger where Hale had lodged the original complaint. Cal set it on the kitchen table, and all 3 of them stood around it like it was something fragile that might reverse itself if they moved too quickly. "Is it real?" Silas said. "It's real," Cal said. "I watched the clerk process it." They stood around it a moment longer. Then Naomi made coffee, because that was what you did, and Cal stayed for an hour, and they talked about spring and what the northeast pasture would need and whether the lumber order was actually going to arrive from Whitmore's mill, and the conversation was ordinary in the way that conversations are ordinary when the extraordinary thing has already happened and everyone is still adjusting to the absence of the wait. After Cal left, Silas went to the barn to do the evening work, and Naomi cleaned up the kitchen, and Lydia came in from outside with cold hands and the news that Deke had agreed to teach her how to mend a leather harness, which she had apparently asked him about 12 times before he agreed, and Naomi warmed her daughter's hands between her own and thought, this house. This ordinary, difficult, imperfect house, with its loose shingle and its drafty back corner and its kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke. This house that she had walked into in the dark of a November evening with 12 cents and a broken suitcase latch and a child holding a wooden horse. She thought, I am not leaving this house. Not as a declaration, not as a plan, just as a fact, recognized with the quiet certainty of something that had been true for a while without being said. She put dinner on. Silas came in from the barn at the usual hour, hung his coat, washed his hands. Lydia was already at the table, explaining to the empty chair across from her. She was practicing, Naomi realized, going over her harness mending lesson in anticipation of Deke, and Silas sat down across from her with the ease of a man who had stopped being surprised by the conversations this child started. The old man at the general store, Lydia said, apparently mid-explanation to the chair. Mr. Pettit. He said hello to Mama today, like he meant it. Pettit always says hello, Silas said. Not like that, Lydia said firmly. Before it was the polite kind. Today it was the real kind. Silas looked at Naomi. She looked back at him. The real kind, he repeated. There's a difference, Lydia said. I can always tell. Naomi set the pot on the table and sat down. She thought about Pettit's changed greeting. She thought about Miss Aldrich squeezing her hand at the schoolhouse door. She thought about the widow Fontaine riding 15 miles in January cold and sitting in that room with her hands folded and her back straight and saying yes when her name was called. She thought about all the ways a valley changes. Not at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of small gestures from people who have decided, one by one, that the thing they were not doing was costing them more than doing it would. She's right, Naomi said. There's a difference. Silas looked at her for a moment with the particular steadiness he'd had since the morning in the kitchen when they'd said the things they'd said without saying them all the way. Then he reached for the bread, and Lydia resumed her explanation to the empty chair, and the kitchen was full of warmth and ordinary noise, and outside the February wind was working at the loose shingle on the roof the same as it always had, and none of it was perfect, and all of it was real. And it was, Naomi Carter thought, more than enough. The lumber arrived from Whitmore's mill on a Tuesday in the first week of March, 2 wagons of it, more than Silas had ordered and cut to better specifications than he'd paid for, which was Jonas Whitmore's way of apologizing without using the word. Silas stood in the yard and watched the drivers unload it and said nothing about the extra boards, just directed them where to stack it, and afterward he stood looking at the pile for a long moment with his hands in his pockets. Naomi watched him from the kitchen window. She was learning the difference between his silences now. This one was not the heavy kind, not the kind that meant something was working in him that hadn't resolved yet. This one was lighter. This was the silence of a man who had been waiting for a thing to be over and was standing in the first morning of it being over and wasn't quite sure what to do with his hands. She went out. Good wood, she said, coming to stand beside him. Better than I ordered. Whitmore feels guilty. He should. She looked at the pile. The north fence gets done before calving. If the weather holds. It'll hold long enough. He looked at her sideways, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did more often now. That almost smile that had once stopped itself every time and now occasionally didn't. You don't actually know that. No, she agreed, but I found that saying it like I do helps. This time it became a full smile, brief and real, the kind that came from somewhere genuine rather than somewhere practiced. And Naomi looked back at the lumber pile because she'd found that looking directly at that smile did something to her equilibrium that she was still getting accustomed to. They began the fence work the following week. Silas and Deke doing the heavy post work, Naomi alongside them doing what she could, which turned out to be more than either man had expected. She'd helped Thomas with fence repair in their early years, before the cattle operation had grown enough to hire men for it, and she hadn't forgotten the fundamentals. Lydia appeared each afternoon after school and handed nails and held lengths of wire and asked Deke questions about the structural integrity of different post-setting techniques with the earnest precision of a child who had decided that understanding how things worked was a primary obligation of living in the world. Deke answered in his characteristic short syllables, which Lydia had by now learned to unpack with considerable skill. It was during the third day of fence work that Will Peterson rode over with news from his father. The elder Peterson had been to town the day before and had spoken to 3 different men who'd had business with Victor Hale in the past year, and what he'd found was this. Hale was pulling back. Not dramatically, not in one visible move, but in the accumulated way of a man revising his calculations. He'd let 2 of his hired men go. He'd declined to renew a grazing lease on the Fontaine property's eastern border that he'd been holding for 2 years through an arrangement that had never been entirely comfortable. He'd been seen, according to Will's father, at the bank in town having a long and apparently not pleasant conversation with his own financial manager. Dad says it's like watching a man decide which battles he can still win, Will said. He was around 20, Will Peterson, with his father's pragmatic eyes and a directness that came from growing up on a working ranch where there wasn't time for the long way around anything. He's consolidating. He's not leaving, Silas said. It wasn't a question. No, he's got too much here, but he's... Will looked for the word. He's adjusting what he thinks is possible. Silas looked out at the fence line. As long as the northeast section stays clear, that's what matters for now. Dad thinks it'll stay clear, Will said. He said Hale's not stupid enough to start something he already lost once. After Will left, Silas went back to the post he'd been setting, and Naomi watched him work for a while in the particular way she'd started watching him, not with the careful analytical attention she'd used in the early weeks, reading him for signs of what the situation required, but with something different, something more like the way you watch someone when you've decided you want to keep watching them. She was aware of this. She was aware of most things about herself, for better or worse, and this was no exception. She knew what was happening between them the way you know a season is changing. Not from one dramatic day, but from the accumulation of small shifts, the angle of light, the smell of the air, the way a morning feels different from the morning 3 weeks ago, even when everything visible seems the same. She also knew she was afraid of it, not of him. She'd never been afraid of him, which had been one of the first things she'd registered about him, that first evening in this kitchen when he'd stepped back from the door and said, "Come inside." But afraid of herself, of her own judgment, of the particular danger of needing something very much and therefore seeing it as being there when it might not be, not fully, not in the way she needed it. She had been wrong about things before. She had trusted Thomas's optimism about the cattle business when she should have asked harder questions. She had believed the boarding house was stable until the bills surfaced. She was capable of seeing what she wanted to see, and she knew it. And the knowledge made her careful in ways that sometimes looked like coldness and weren't. But she was also, and this was the thing she kept returning to, the thing that sat with her in the kitchen in the early mornings before anyone was up, and she was alone with the coffee and the low gray light. She was also a woman who had walked in cold and starving and nearly out of everything, and she had asked for work instead of charity, and she had been right. Not about everything. Not about the situation she was walking into, not about Victor Hale or the land dispute or any of it, but about the door. She had been right about the door. Maybe she was right about this too. It was Lydia who moved things first. Because of course it was. It was a Sunday in mid-March, the particular Sunday when the temperature went up 10 degrees from the day before, and the whole valley smelled like mud and the very beginning of something green trying to happen under all that cold. Lydia had been outside since after breakfast, conducting what she called an investigation into how many birds had come back and which ones they were. And she came in at mid-morning with her boots muddy and her notebook full of careful entries and the wooden horse tucked under her arm, which she still carried when she was thinking hard about something. She stood in the kitchen where Naomi was working and said, without preamble, "Are you going to marry Silas?" Naomi set down what she was holding. "That's a significant question," she said. "I know." Lydia was not embarrassed by it. She was 8 years old and she asked significant questions the way most people asked for the salt. "I was just wondering, because I think you should." Naomi looked at her daughter. "Do you?" "He's good," Lydia said, with the directness of someone who had thought about this and arrived at a conclusion. Not perfect. He didn't fix that window latch even though it's been broken for a month." She said this as a genuine data point rather than a criticism. "But he listens. And he didn't get the look. And he made tea when I was sick." She turned the wooden horse over in her hands. "Papa would have liked him." That last sentence landed somewhere in Naomi's chest with the particular weight of things that are true and surprising and painful and comforting all at the same time. She stood very still for a moment. "You think so?" she said. "Papa liked people who were straight," Lydia said. "That's what you always said about him. He liked people who were straight." She looked up at her mother. "Silas is straight." Naomi looked at her daughter. This child who had carried a wooden horse through everything, who had named a ranch horse Gerald, who had made a ranch hand with the conversational instincts of a fence post. Talk about his dog, who had sat in a schoolroom and charmed a teacher and come home every afternoon and made this strange and difficult situation feel, gradually, like something that made sense. "I know he is," Naomi said. "So?" Lydia said. "So?" Naomi said. "That's not entirely how it works." Lydia's expression communicated clearly that she found adult decision-making processes inefficient. "I'll think about it," Naomi said. "You already think about it," Lydia said. "I can tell." She put her notebook on the table and went to wash her hands, and Naomi stood in the kitchen and realized that her 8-year-old was right, as her 8-year-old often was, and that the thinking she'd been doing for weeks had not been the undecided kind but the afraid kind, and that there was a difference, and she knew which one she was done with. She found Silas in the barn that evening. He was working on the harness that had been his excuse to sit at the kitchen table the night she'd arrived. She'd noticed it was still only half mended, a fact that she'd never mentioned but had registered with something that was not quite amusement and not quite fondness, and was probably both. He was working on it now with the methodical attention he brought to physical tasks, the same concentration he brought to everything that wasn't conversation. She came in and sat on the bench along the near wall, the one Lydia had claimed as her regular observation post during horse visiting hours. Hester turned to look at her from the nearest stall with the mild, interested expression of a horse who has accepted that humans appear in barns at irregular intervals for reasons that don't require full understanding. Silas glanced up. "Something wrong?" "No," she said. He went back to the harness. She watched him work for a moment. Then she said, "Lydia asked me this morning if I was going to marry you." His hands stopped. He didn't look up immediately. He set the harness down slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man making sure he's finished what he was doing before he starts doing something else. Then he looked at her. "What did you tell her?" he said. "I told her I'd think about it." Naomi held his eyes. "I've been thinking about it." The barn was very quiet. Gerald, who was in the far stall and had been pointedly ignoring everyone, shifted his weight with a sound like a slow exhale, and one of the other horses moved somewhere in the back. And outside, the early evening wind was doing its usual business with the loose shingle that still hadn't been fixed, and all of it was just the ordinary sound of a place that had been lived in. "Naomi," Silas said. "I know this is not a simple thing," she said, before he could continue. "I know I came here as your employee, and that creates I know there are complications. I'm not pretending there aren't. And I know I have a daughter, and that changes what this means and what it requires. And I know that you've been alone for a long time, and that alone gets to be its own kind of comfortable even when it's not what you'd choose if you were choosing." She stopped. "I'm saying all of this because I want to say it plainly, and not—" She looked at her hands. "Not perform it, not make it easier than it is. I'm not good at easier than it is." "I've noticed," he said, and his voice was different than usual, quieter.
something careful in it. "What I'm trying to say," she said, "is that I'm not asking you for anything you haven't already decided. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm just—" She looked back up at him. "I'm saying that if you wanted to ask me something, you could, and my answer would not be no." Silas sat with that for a long moment. He was looking at her with the full directness he usually distributed carefully. The look that she'd learned meant he was not managing what he felt, but carrying it. "I've been trying to figure out how to ask you since November," he said. She blinked. "November." "When you fixed the curtain," he said, "first morning." He picked up the harness again, not to work on it, just to have something in his hands. "I thought, this person. I want this person to stay." He set it back down. "Then all the rest of it happened, and I thought maybe I was—" He stopped. "Confusing things," she said. "Yes." "Were you?" He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I wasn't." She breathed. "Lydia said her father would have liked you," she said. Something moved across his face, surprise, and something deeper behind it, the specific emotion of being seen in a way you didn't expect and don't entirely know what to do with. "She said that?" "She said you're straight. It was a compliment." He was quiet for a moment. "She named my horse Gerald." "She did." "I never asked her why." "I wouldn't," Naomi said. "The answer will take a while." He made the sound that was becoming more familiar to her now. The one that was not quite a laugh but was in the same neighborhood, honest and brief and real. Then he stood up from the workbench and crossed the barn floor, and he stopped in front of where she was sitting, and he was a tall man and she was sitting down, so she had to look up at him, and she did. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He asked her. Plainly, without ceremony, without the language of performance, just the question, simple and direct, the way he said everything that mattered. She said yes, also plainly, also without ceremony. He put his hand out, and she took it, and they stood like that for a moment in the barn with the horses, and the evening light coming in at a low angle through the open door. And it was not a perfect moment. Her boots were muddy, and his hands were rough from a week of fence work. And there was a horse somewhere behind them eating hay with a thoroughness that was frankly distracting. And none of that mattered at all. They told Lydia at breakfast the next morning. Lydia listened to the information with the gravity of someone receiving a report she had in fact commissioned and was now verifying for accuracy. Then she said, "I knew it," with a satisfaction that was entirely without smugness, because she was not that kind of child. Just a child who had reached a correct conclusion and was glad to have it confirmed. Then she looked at Silas and said, "You have to fix the window latch." Silas looked at Naomi. Naomi looked at the ceiling. "I'll fix the window latch," he said. "Today?" "This week." Lydia considered this acceptable and went back to her breakfast, and Silas sat across from her with the expression of a man who was beginning to understand what he had agreed to in the larger sense of the word, and Naomi thought, good. Let him understand it. It was worth understanding. They told Deke next, because Deke was part of the household in the way that people are part of households when they've been in them long enough and nobody's made a formal decision about it. Silas told him in the barn. Naomi didn't hear what was said, but Deke came in for his noon meal that day and looked at Naomi across the kitchen and said, "Good," in the tone of a man who has been waiting for a thing to be done and is relieved it finally has been. That was the full extent of his response, and it was somehow one of the things that felt most real about the whole morning. They told Cal and Helen in person, riding out to the Marsh Ranch on a Saturday. Helen's reaction was to hug Naomi with an efficiency and warmth that made Naomi feel, briefly and almost unexpectedly, like she'd been seen by someone she hadn't fully realized had been seeing her. Cal shook Silas's hand, then looked at Naomi and said, "He's going to keep needing someone to tell him what the next step is." "I know," Naomi said, "and you're going to keep needing someone who'll stand in the room and say the hard thing." "I know that too." Cal nodded, once, with the finality of a man who considers the matter correctly arranged. The news moved through the valley in the usual way, which is to say, fast and with embellishment, though in this case the embellishment was mostly from Ed Briggs, who told it to at least 11 people before the end of the following week, and improved the story each time without, as far as Naomi could tell, intending to deceive anyone. It simply got bigger in his hands the way everything did.
Clara Briggs sent a note with a jar of apple preserves and the single line, "Knew it from the night of the meeting. Ed owes me $1." The widow Fontaine sent a letter. It was longer than her previous letters, 5 full sentences, which for her was effusive. She said she was glad. She said that watching Naomi turn Victor Hale down at the door of Silas Boone's ranch had been the thing that made her sign her name to Cal's counterfiling without hesitation. She said, "I watched you stand in that yard and I thought, there it is. That's what it looks like. I'd forgotten." And then she said she hoped they'd be well, and that was all, and it was enough. The wedding was in May. Not because May was romantic, though the valley in May was something worth witnessing, everything that had been pressed down under months of cold suddenly insisting on existing with an urgency that felt almost aggressive, but because May was when the fence work was done and the calving was settled and the northeast pasture was already showing the grass that the winter's boundary dispute had nearly cost them, coming up green and real and exactly where it was supposed to be. They were married outside the small church at the edge of Willow Ridge. Naomi had not planned the outside part. They'd arranged to use the church. But the morning was so clear and the air so good that the minister, a mild man named Fletcher, who had married enough couples to know that ceremony serves the people and not the other way around, simply walked everyone out the front door and conducted the whole thing in the yard under the open sky, and nobody objected. Helen Marsh had brought wildflowers from somewhere and pressed them on Naomi at the door. Naomi had not asked for flowers, and had not been expecting them, and held them through the whole ceremony because she didn't know what else to do with them, and also because they were the right thing, exactly, which was the most you could say about anything. Lydia stood beside them in a dress that was new, actually new, which Naomi had made possible by way of the Friday payments she'd been carefully keeping since November. And she was holding the wooden horse under one arm because she had refused to leave it at the ranch. And when Naomi had pointed out this was a wedding, Lydia had said that the horse was important to her, and she was bringing it, and that was the end of that conversation. Cal stood with Silas. Deke stood on the other side of Cal with the expression of a man experiencing strong feelings that he was containing with significant effort. At one point, Naomi thought she saw him blink rapidly several times, and she looked away because she thought he would prefer that. Ed Briggs cried openly and blamed the spring air. Clara Briggs patted his arm and said nothing, which was her form of affection. The widow Fontaine had ridden 15 miles to be there, same as January, same as always, and she stood near the back of the small gathered crowd and watched with an expression that was a private one, the expression of someone watching something that means something specific to them that they haven't told anyone. When Minister Fletcher asked the questions and Silas said what he said and Naomi said what she was aware of 2 things simultaneously. The first was that her hands were not shaking. She had been certain they would shake. She was not someone who managed emotion without some physical evidence of it. But they were steady, genuinely steady, the way her back had been that first evening on his porch. The second was that she was happy. Not performed happiness, not relief dressed as happiness, not the happiness of escaping something, but the plain, undefended, real kind, which she had not been certain she would know how to do anymore, and which turned out to come back to you when the conditions were right, not smoothly or on schedule, but with the stubborn, undeniable insistence of grass in May coming up through months of cold. Silas was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her since November in the barn, since the morning in the kitchen, since she'd stood in front of Victor Hale's men and said, "I'm staying," with the particular steadiness of a man who had found something he'd given up looking for and was not planning to look away. She looked back. The ranch changed after that, the way things change when they're allowed to be what they were already becoming. It changed slowly, the way Naomi had learned real things changed, not in grand declarations, but in the accumulation of small decisions made by people who had decided to make them. Silas fixed the window latch, first week of June, without being reminded. Naomi's name went on the deed in July, through a process Cal helped them navigate that was not complicated but required going to town twice and filing 2 forms and waiting 3 weeks, which she spent in a state of patience that was not entirely natural, but that she maintained because some things were worth the wait. The northeast pasture yielded what it was supposed to that season. The fence held. The calving numbers were good, not exceptional, not some miracle, just good, the normal good of land properly cared for and animals properly tended. Silas sold his cattle through Cal's cousin in Billings and through the Archers' direct buyer in Helena, and the fall numbers were the best in 3 years. Victor Hale stayed in the valley. He had told Silas he would, and he did, and the adjustment he had described in the kitchen of Silas's house appeared to be genuine, or genuine enough to make a practical difference, which was the kind of genuine that mattered in the real world as opposed to the kind that mattered in stories. He did not become a good man. Naomi did not expect him to, and would not have trusted the version of this story where he did. He became, instead, a smaller man, not in size or wealth, but in scope. The particular smallness of someone who has run the math and found the cost of a certain kind of behavior exceeds the benefit, and has adjusted accordingly. Whether that was remorse or just calculation, Naomi honestly wasn't sure. She thought it was probably both, and she thought that was probably the most honest version of most people's better moments. The Dreyer family received a payment from Hale's lawyers in early autumn. It was not the full value of what they'd lost. Naomi heard about it through Cal, who heard through Helen, who heard from the Dreyer family's representative in Billings. She sat with this information for a while, the justice of it, the incompleteness of it, the fact that a family who had loaded a wagon in February and driven away from everything they'd built received money 3 years later that could not return the years or the effort or the place that had been theirs. She sat with it, and then she put it away in the part of herself where she kept things that were true and unresolved, because some things don't resolve, and the wisdom is not in pretending otherwise, but in knowing which things do and which things don't, and treating each accordingly. Lydia turned 9 in September. She had been campaigning for a dog since March, methodically, the way she did everything, building a case, addressing objections, citing precedent including but not limited to Deke's dog Ray, who had reportedly opened his own Christmas presents and was by any measure a successful ranch dog. She had addressed the question of care, the question of cost, the question of where the dog would sleep, and the specific question Silas had raised about the ranch cat's likely response, which she acknowledged was a real concern but felt could be managed through what she called a careful introduction period. Her birthday present was a dog. Brown, medium-sized, approximately 4 months old, obtained through Will Peterson, whose family's dog had recently produced an uncounted number of puppies. Lydia named him immediately, before the animal had been in the yard 30 seconds. "Newton," she announced. Naomi looked at Silas. Silas looked at Naomi. "Why Newton?" Silas asked. "Because he's going to figure things out," Lydia said, with the certainty of someone who has already seen the future and is simply reporting on it. Newton turned out to be a dog of immense enthusiasm and limited coordination who knocked over 2 pails in the first week and ate one of Deke's work gloves, and Deke's reaction to this was to say, in a tone that somehow conveyed both irritation and acceptance. And within a month, Newton had attached himself to Deke in the specific dog manner that means you have been claimed, and Deke could be seen on most mornings walking toward the barn with Newton at his heels, talking to him in the short syllables he used for everything. And Newton listened to these monologues with complete attention and evident satisfaction. Lydia observed this development with the satisfaction of someone who had predicted it and noted it in her notebook. There was one evening in November, almost exactly a year from the night Naomi had first knocked at the gate, when the 4 of them were in the kitchen after dinner. Silas was reading something, the natural history book she'd given him for his birthday in August. Lydia was at the table with her notebook, adding to an ongoing list of things she intended to know more about. Naomi was mending, which she had never particularly loved but had made a kind of peace with. Newton was under the table with his head on Deke's boot, and Deke was not there to object because he'd gone back to the bunkhouse an hour ago, but Newton had decided this was where he wanted to be, and the boot was a reasonable substitute. The wind outside was doing what November wind does in Montana, which is argue with every surface it encounters. The loose shingle was gone. Silas had replaced it in October, along with 3 others that had been on their way out. And what you heard now was just the clean sound of wind against solid wood, which was its own kind of comfort. Naomi set down the mending and looked at the room. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at things over the past year, slowly, with the full attention of someone who understands that the ordinary moment is the thing, not the prelude to the thing, not the intermission between things, but the actual substance of a life. She looked at Silas, reading with the focused quiet of a man who had come back to the habit of stillness without the weight it used to carry. She looked at Lydia, whose pen moved across her notebook with the urgency of a child who feels that all the world's phenomena are trying to happen faster than she can record them. She looked at Newton, who was asleep with his legs at impractical angles and making the soft, involuntary sounds of a dog doing important work in a dream. She thought about the road she'd walked down a year ago, the broken suitcase latch, the 12 cents, the 6 doors that had closed. She did not think about it with the ache she'd once thought would never leave. That ache had changed shape, the way grief and hard things do when you survive them and go on living. It had not disappeared. She did not believe it would entirely disappear. But it was no longer the thing at the center of everything. It was further back where it belonged. Part of the story, part of how she'd gotten here, part of who she was, which was a woman who had walked far enough in the cold to find the one door that opened. She picked the mending back up. "You're looking at things again," Silas said, without looking up from his book. "I look at things," she said. "You have a specific look," he said, "when you're taking inventory." "I grew up poor," she said. "Taking inventory is a habit." He looked up then, and there it was. The smile, the real one, the one that came from somewhere genuine. "What's this count?" She looked around the room again. Newton, dreaming. Lydia, recording the world. The fire steady and the wind outside doing its honest work against solid walls. The man across from her who had stepped back from a door when most people would have closed it. "Good," she said. "The count is good." He looked at her a moment longer, then looked back at his book. Lydia looked up from her notebook. "What are you counting?" "Everything," Naomi said. Lydia seemed to find this a reasonable answer. She went back to her notebook. Newton dreamed on. The fire held. Outside, the Montana dark was enormous and cold and full of stars. The kind of sky you only get when there's nothing between you and it. No city light, no cloud cover, just the absolute fact of how large the world is, and how long the night is, and how many things there are that have nothing to do with any one person's particular story. And inside, in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the faint muddy presence of a sleeping dog. Naomi Carter. Naomi Boone. Now, though she was still getting used to the sound of it, sat with her mending in her lap, and her family in the same room, and the particular peace of a woman who had been through enough to know that peace is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something worth protecting. She had knocked on the last door. It had opened, and everything that mattered, everything that had been taken, everything that had been fought for, everything that had been built one cold morning at a time, was here, in this room, real and imperfect and hers. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was in every way that counted more than enough.